Hi guys, Olive here. Here today to do an author spotlight on Helene Hanff, author of 84 Charing Cross Road, as well as a number of other books that I will be discussing in this video. But in this video, I will also be discussing Helene Hanff herself, who she was as a person, her background, her writing style, those types of things. But obviously my focus is going to be on her work. And by her work, I mean her books, and more specifically, I mean the 6 books she wrote for adults. Helene Hanff did a lot of writing over her lifetime. She did lots of different types of writing, and not all of that is accessible, like her plays, for instance. She wrote a lot of plays, and as far as I can tell, all of those were lost or destroyed. I wasn't able to read any of them. I know she also wrote 2 children's books. I wasn't able to get my hands on those. Even the 6 books that are still out there in the world, they can even be a little bit hard to get your hands on. Because of those accessibility issues, those are the 6 books that I'm choosing to focus on in this video. I will be giving you my own personal feelings about all 6 of these books as we go along, and also at the end of the video, I will give you my own recommendation of where I think you should start if you're looking to get into her work. Before we get started talking about the books, let's talk a little bit about the author. Helene Hanff, and it is pronounced Helene. I have seen a number of different sources say that. She was born on April 15th, 1916 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where then she was raised by her mother and her father. They were lovers of the theater in her household, but they were not very well off financially. So her father actually used to trade the shirts that he would sell to people working in the box office in exchange for tickets. Around the time that Helene would have been considering attending college, so toward the end of her high school experience, it was in the midst of the Great Depression, and her family, who was not wealthy, like I just said, they knew they couldn't afford to send her. So she actually started attending this specialty high school that would prepare its students to apply for scholarships. And even though it seemed unlikely that she was going to receive a scholarship because she wasn't the most stellar student, she did get a scholarship to Temple University, which for all of my non-Pennsylvanian viewers out there is also located in Philadelphia. But Helene only got to go to Temple for 1 year. And that's because all the money that was set aside for her scholarship had to be redirected to rising seniors who could no longer afford tuition, again, because this was in the middle of the Depression. So she lost her scholarship, basically. Now, Helene did say in one of her books that it wasn't much of a disappointment when she had to leave Temple because she wasn't getting to study what she really wanted to study. I'm assuming during that first year, she was taking a lot of basic courses, prerequisites, and that kind of thing. And she really wanted to study writing and English, and she wasn't getting to do that at Temple. So toward the end of her first year at Temple, she went to the Philadelphia Public Library in search of a teacher who would teach her the things that she wanted to learn. And this is how she discovered Sir Arthur Quiller Couch, also known just as Q, who was a writer, a critic, and also a lecturer at the University of Cambridge. It would not be a hyperbole to say that his book on writing and then the 5 volumes of his lectures were absolutely life-changing for Helene. It became her college education, working through those volumes of lectures. But, as she says in one of her books, it took her 11 years to get through those 5 volumes because she would keep coming up against things that were unfamiliar. Q was a lecturer at Cambridge, and so he assumed that his students had a specific type of background and that they had read certain things, and Helene often hadn't read those things. So, for instance, during a section on Paradise Lost, not only had she not read Paradise Lost, she hadn't read the New Testament, and a lot of Paradise Lost is based on things in the New Testament. So she had to stop reading the lecture, go and read the New Testament of the Bible, and then go and read Paradise Lost before she could return to the lecture. She had those kinds of wait here moments, as she calls them, all the time, which is why it took her so long to get through those 5 volumes. But really, it kind of meant that she was structuring her own university education because she would have her assigned reading and then she would go and read the lecture. So although Helene Hanff lacked a formal education, she never had a degree, she kind of gave herself an education, which I just have to insert my own opinion here. I think that is so admirable. If she wasn't able to get it the regular way, she was able to get it in a roundabout way, and she did it all herself. I just think that's incredible. But her teacher, Q, being an English lecturer and talking a lot about English literature, she developed a taste for English literature that never really left her, and that will become important later on. But after she was done at Temple, and after she had discovered Q at the library, and was in the very early phases of what would become the years-long self-education process, she worked at a bookshop over the summer, and then she took a 90-day secretarial course. Her uncle knew someone, so she was able to get a reduced rate. She used the skills that she gained at that business school to get a series of office jobs where she worked over the next 2 years. And somewhere in that period of time, she joined a local theater club and became what she calls stage struck. She had always loved the theater, but now she wanted to be involved. She did some acting, and now in the evenings after work, instead of studying with Q, as she had been for 2 years, she started writing plays. In 1938, though, everything changed for Helene because she was working as a typist at a diesel engine school when she found out that she was one of 12 winners of a national playwriting competition. It was being sponsored by the theater guilds, and for winning, she received a $1,500 fellowship, which in today's money would be about $30,000, to support her for a year in New York while she wrote and also while she attended this seminar that the theater guild was going to hold for the 12 winners to teach them the art of playwriting. This was a new addition to this competition. The previous year, they had just given the winners the money and let them go about their business. But this year, they seemed pretty insistent, no, we also have to teach these people how to write. And it ended up being a complete failure because the guild produced a number of flops or failed plays in a row, so their credibility wasn't great. And then none of the 12 winners ever wrote anything for Broadway. That didn't stop Helene from trying, though. Even after that fellowship money was long gone, she stayed in New York City through the 1940s. She kept writing. She kept trying to get these plays produced. I think she wrote at least 20 plays, maybe even more, and none of them ever hit the stage. She said about her plays at one point that they specialized in plotless charm, that her dialogue was always great, but she really struggled with coming up with a good story. And that brings us to Helene's very first book, the 1961 memoir, Underfoot in Show Business. And in this book, she discusses winning that competition, moving to New York, trying to write these plays, dealing with agents, eventually being unsuccessful, so trying to support herself in other ways. And also she talks a lot about her adventures in the big city with her really close friend, the actress Maxine Stewart. This is a really fun, albeit kind of insidery book because a lot of it is about the machine of how a Broadway show is produced, what the writers go through, how difficult it is to get anyone to see your play, and how difficult all these agents are to deal with. But it is really cool because at one point she's working for the theater guilds and they're producing a new play after a series of flops, so there's nothing to indicate that this new one's going to be a success, and yet it's the musical Oklahoma. So you get to see kind of what was going on behind the scenes and what everyone thought of the musical before it hit the stage. And now it's still a very iconic musical. So that was a very unexpected surprise in this book. But I should also mention that Helene Hanff does talk at length about her financial woes in this book and the different things she had to do for money in order to support herself while she was attempting to become a playwright. On a number of different occasions, she actually had to go back to Philadelphia, leave the city, and go back to her parents' house because she ran out of money. She was always able to get back, but that was a reality of her situation. For a time, she was working in the publicity department at the Theater Guilds, which is why she was around for the whole Oklahoma thing, but that was a full-time gig and it didn't give her any time to write. So eventually she did get a part-time job as an outside reader for a film studio, meaning that she would read plays and books and summarize them them in case the film studio would want to make a movie based on those works. She liked that job because she could work from home and then she could continue to write her plays. And then eventually she did start writing for television. She talks about those jobs in this book, and I mention that because she held some of these jobs as she was corresponding with the bookshop Marks & Co., which I will be talking about when I discuss her most popular book, 84 Charing Cross Road. That's coming up next. But this book gives a lot of really good background, and it kind of fleshes out some things in 84 Charing Cross Road because she mentions those jobs in her letters, and here you get to find out what those jobs actually entailed. But I would say this book overall discusses the hardships that she faced when she was trying to make it as a playwright in New York City. But that doesn't mean that this is all doom and gloom. It still is a really fun, really smart, really entertaining book. It's just honest about what she went through. But now the time has finally come to discuss the most well-known, the most well-loved of Helene Hanff's books. This book is the reason why a lot of people know her name, and it's the reason why a lot of readers, including myself, then go out in search of her other books and information about her, kind of like I'm doing in this video. It's 84 Charing Cross Road. This little book of letters that has captured the hearts of many. This book is a record of the 20-year correspondence between Helene and people who either worked at or were associated with this little bookshop in central London called Marks & Co. Antiquarian Booksellers. And it's worth noting that that Co. does not actually stand for company. It stands for Cohen, as in Mr. Cohen, who was a co-owner of the shop along with Mr. Marks. Helene Hanff sent her original letter to Marks & Co. in early October 1949. She had seen them advertise in the Saturday Review of Literature, and they said in that ad that they specialized in out-of-print books, which is what she was looking for. So she sent them a letter, and she also sent them a list of books that she happened to be looking for, and she told them what she was willing to pay. Because, again, at the time, she was struggling financially. She would struggle financially throughout her entire life, and at the time, she was a would-be playwright. So she didn't have a lot of money to spend on out-of-print books. Now, the reasoning that Helene gave for reaching out to a bookshop across the Atlantic to find these books was that she couldn't find some of these books in New York City, and then the ones that she could find, they were in either very ratty editions or too nice editions that were then prohibitively expensive. And maybe that was true at the start with that original list that she sent them, but I have a hard time believing that continued to be true for 20 years. We're talking about New York City. We're not talking about Omaha. This is the most well-connected city in the world. You would think that if she had wandered into any bookshop, she probably could have found some of these books. But I think the reason why she kept buying from them for 20 years was that she liked the romance of it. Again, she had a thing for English literature, and she just had a thing for England, just had a thing for London. She loved it. And so I think there was a special something about receiving these books from a bookshop in London. But whatever her motive was, for the next 20 years, she kept buying books from Marks & Co. And because of her outgoing, sociable nature, she made friends with just about everyone she spoke with. So there was her main point of contact, who was Frank Dole, who worked at Marks & Co. and who answered her letters and fulfilled her requests and accepted her payment. He was the main point of contact. But over time, Helene also became friendly with his wife, Nora. She learned all about their little family. Helene started talking to other people who worked at the bookstore. She also spoke with Frank and Nora's elderly neighbor at one point. Like, she was just friends with everyone. She was larger than life, very gregarious. She would send these really funny letters, as you can read in this book, and everyone loved her. And pretty early on in their correspondence, she started sending them food parcels and other types of gifts. And there are two things you need to understand about that fact. The first thing is that when she started doing that, These were the very early post-war years in England, and the country was still very much still recovering from World War II. So rationing was still going on. A lot of basic things that we now take for granted, they couldn't get their hands on. So while it may not seem like a big deal to send them a box full of meat and eggs, that was a huge deal for them at the time. And the second thing you should realize is that Helene had never met any of these people, and she was not rich. So even though this was a business correspondence, like it could have been as simple as, here are the books I want, and here's the money, and then they send the books, and that's the end of it. That wasn't the case here. These people developed really close personal relationships. They were so grateful to her for sending those things. So they really cherished one another, all of these people over in London and then Helene overseas. They kept begging her to come over for a visit. They wanted to show her how grateful they were. They offered to let her stay with them as long as she wanted to. And as much as Helene wanted to do that, there was always a situation or a problem with the finances that got in her way. It's worth noting at this point that Helene Hanff did have a little bit of a Murphy's Law kind of life. Even if she would have had some reservations about the travel to London, as some places have insinuated she felt, she legitimately did have all of these different issues pop up which prevented her from going. Like, she had 2 different situations where she got kicked out of her apartment, not because she was a bad tenant, but because they were going to renovate the building and they forced her to leave. That happened to her one time, she moved. It happened to her a second time, she had to find a whole new apartment, and then all the money that she had saved up to go to London, she put toward new furniture because she worked from home. She wanted to have nice furniture for the first time in her life, so you can't really blame her. But then she started to build up her savings again, and she had a dental problem. She had to get all of her teeth capped or else she was going to lose them. She talks about that in 84 Charing Cross Road. It was so incredibly expensive. And then every single time she would save up the money, something else came up. She had a lot of different health problems. She had cataract surgery at one point, and that was a whole ordeal. I think it's implied at one point that she had a hysterectomy. I don't think she comes out and says it, but I'm pretty sure she did. So she had a lot of these things going on, and it's not like she had health insurance that could help her pay for it. So anytime something popped up, she had to find a way to pay for it. And a luxury like going to London would have to fall to the back burner. But unfortunately, those early issues that I mentioned prevented her from getting over to London in time to meet Frank Dole and to visit the shop. Because in late 1968, Frank Dole very unexpectedly died, and then almost exactly 2 years later, the shop closed. And when Helene Hanff received a letter that you'll read in this book saying that Frank Dole had died, she was upset, probably doesn't even begin to cover it. And she knew in that moment she wanted to publish the letters. She had kept them for tax purposes. I'm assuming she was able to get some sort of a write-off. So she still had her letters. She reached out to the Doles to get the letters that she had written. She asked to have them back, and she also asked permission if she could publish all of them. And she got permission to do so. It wasn't easy getting this book published because back then and still today, this is a very unconventional book. But it did eventually find a publisher. It was released in 1970 to mainly rave reviews. And it seems like then and now there are some people who just don't see the appeal of this book, but people who love this book, like a passionate love for this book. And it pretty much immediately became a cult classic. And the thing about this book is that the author's address, Helene Hanff's address, where she lived for most of the rest of her life at the end of this book, the Lenox Hill Upper East Side address, was on some of the letters. So fans had a way to get directly in contact with her, and they did. And they did so in droves. And at this point, I'm going to quickly go out of publication order because this next book, which is her 1985 memoir, Q's Legacy, in this book, she talks about what it was like being the author of 84 Charing Cross Road, the cult classic 84 Charing Cross Road. So she starts off by talking about how she discovered Q, or Sir Arthur Quiller Couch, and falling in love with English literature, and then having that correspondence, but then the whole publication saga of 84 Charing Cross Road, as well as the publication saga of her next book, The Duchess of Bloomsbury Street, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment. But in this book, she also talks about interacting with her fans, receiving all this fan mail, and writing back to a lot of them. In this book, she also talks about the early adaptations of 84 Charing Cross Road, like the BBC television adaptation. She actually got to go over to London and watch that being filmed, which was a very emotional experience for her. She also got to go over and see the stage production of it, which was a big hit in England, probably because of the post-war nostalgia. It was not nearly as successful in the United States when they brought it over here. But she does not talk about the movie adaptation because that movie came out in 1987. This memoir was released in 1985. I know that she was aware of the movie. I think she actually watched portions of it being filmed. I do think she liked it. But again, it's not discussed in this book. I have seen the movie, and yes, I do love it. Q's legacy is definitely one you want to read if you want to know more of the story of 84 Charing Cross Road and you want to know more about Helene's life and how the book changed her life. That is all contained in here. She considers it all to be the legacy of Q, Sir Arthur Quiller Couch, her teacher and mentor, who had such an impact on her life. Throughout this book, she seems to just be so astonished by the success of 84 Charing Cross Road, how much it changed her life, how much of a self-esteem boost it was to have work out there that people really loved and appreciated, especially after having so many years of failing as a playwright and not getting her work out there in the way that she wanted to. It was such a good moment for her, and it happened really late in her life. She was in her late middle age when she experienced that success, because just think about it, when 84 Charing Cross Road was published, she was in her mid-50s, and by the time this book, Q's Legacy, was released, she was almost 70. But now let's go back and quickly discuss the book that she put out immediately after 84 Charing Cross Road, which is The Duchess of Bloomsbury Street. This book came out in 1973, and it's basically her travel diary from her first trip to London in 1971, which was absolutely a dream realized for her. She had been wanting to go to London for so many years, not just because of the bookshop, but because she loved English literature so much, and she wanted to see if the England of English literature was there. And I think that's what she found. She was on cloud nine the entire time. She got to meet fans of 84 Charing Cross Road. She got to meet a lot of the people connected with Marks & Co. She got to at least go see where the store once stood. She got the chance to do all of that while having her first real vacation. And that's what this book is made up of. And it's very satisfying to read, especially right after reading 84 Charing Cross Road. The ability to see her get over to London when she wasn't able to for one reason or another for 20 years. It's really nice. But at least for me, I guess maybe I just don't like the way she writes travel writing. Me and some other reviewers at the time were left a little bit unsatisfied by this book. And I felt kind of similarly about her 1977 book, Apple of My Eye, which is all about New York City. Helene Hanff's adopted city, the city that she loved so much. She lived there for the vast majority of her life. All of her adult life was spent as a New Yorker, and she really loved it there. She talks about wanting to write a book like this one in The Duchess of Bloomsbury Street, because when she was on her trip to London, people said things to her about New York City that she didn't care for. They would ask her how she felt safe living in New York. They would pass judgment on the city despite not knowing anything about it. So I feel like this book was kind of a response to that. She got the opportunity to write this because she got this dream assignment to write copy for a book of photographs of New York City. And it seemed like it was going to be a cakewalk because she had lived in New York City for so long. She felt like she knew everything about it. But when she sat down and thought about the different landmarks that they were likely to take photographs of and that she would have to start writing about, she realized she didn't know much about New York City's most famous landmarks. So she and her friend Patsy Gibbs, who was a native New Yorker, spent 2 months being tourists in their own city, going on tours, sightseeing. Helene kept a diary during that time, and this is a book all about that experience. It's a book very much of its time. Of course, 1970s New York is going to look a lot different than the New York City of today. And like I said before, Helene Hanff's travel writing, even though she's in her own city, this is kind of travel writing. I don't like it as much as I like her other writing. I'm also not a big fan of New York City, not for the reasons that the Londoners were passing judgment on it. It's just not really my style. But if you want more of Helene Hanff's writing and you like New York City, then you are likely to enjoy this one a lot more than I did. But her other book about New York City is actually the one that I enjoyed a lot more, and it's the last book that she ever published. It came out in 1992. It's called Letter from New York. This book is a collection of her scripts from these once-a-month 5-minute radio talks that she would give for the BBC Woman's Hour, and they asked her to talk just about her life in New York City. I'm assuming she had a little bit of a fan base over in London and in the UK, which is why they asked her to do it, and she just talks about her life. She was given a 6-month trial period to start giving these talks beginning in 1978. Well, 6 months turned into 6 years, and she gave these talks from 1978 through 1984. I think the reason why I like this one more is that it's more personal, and my attraction to Helene Hanff and her writing is just her as a person. I just think she was an incredible person, and I love anything in her work that feels personal. And these talks are more personal. They're just about her life in New York City. You get to learn about all the different people in her life, at least during those years. So there's her friend Arlene, the very well-to-do, sophisticated woman, Helene's polar opposite, but they were really, really close friends. You get to hear about her neighbors and all the different dogs in her building and in her life. She was a dog lover through and through. Because these are just 5-minute talks, each one of these scripts is just this concise little snapshot of her life at the time, the New York City at the time. They are so captivating and just completely charming. Helene Hanff died in April 1997, less than a week before her 81st birthday. So she was 80 when she died. And she had been having a number of health problems. She was living in a nursing home when she died. She had had a lot of health problems as a younger woman, so you can only imagine that as an elderly woman, she had a lot as well. She had been having a series of bronchial infections, likely because she was such a heavy smoker throughout her life. But I saw she also had pneumonia and diabetes. I'm not sure which of those was actually responsible for killing her, but I'm guessing it was a combination of all of those things. And she died as she lived, more or less broke. At the time that she died, she was living off of royalties, Social Security, and also she had received a grant from the Authors League Fund. All of this went to paying her hospital bills. I just have to say that I think it is a real shame that she never got to be financially comfortable in her lifetime. Even though she wrote a book that is as iconic and beloved as 84 Charing Cross Road, she never got to experience the spoils of that. I don't think there was ever a time in her life when she wasn't worried about where her next paycheck was coming from and how she was going to pay her rent. And that really breaks my heart. But even though she always struggled financially, I have read that, true to form, she always made sure that the Dole family got their share of the 84 Charing Cross Road royalties. That is very much like Helene, to make sure that they were taken care of first, probably even before herself. She actually joked that her share of the royalties from 84 Charing Cross Road went toward postage to return all the fan letters that she received. But I do wish she had received more for her books, because she was, during her lifetime, and still is in the form of her books, a treasure Like, even being such a sassy New Yorker, she wrote these heartfelt, hilarious, charming little books that just make you fall in love with her. 84 Charing Cross Road is still beloved today, and rightfully so, because it's incredible, and it's absolutely where you should start if you've never read any of her books before. That book will instruct you what to do next, because if you love it, then it's worth moving on to some of her other books, and depending on what you love about it will help you figure out where to move next, but I'll talk about that in just a second. But 84 Charing Cross Road is pretty much the book by Helene Hanff. It's like the quintessential book about books, because it's this love letter to bookshops, even though that's kind of ironic because Helene herself didn't really care for bookshops. She has said in her books that she didn't like to just buy a book she'd never read. She would pull it out from the library, read it. If she loved it, then she would buy it from a bookshop. So Helene Hanff didn't necessarily love all bookshops, but she definitely loved that one. But then after you read 84 Charing Cross Road, I think you have a few different options, and any of them will be completely fine. However you want to go about reading the rest of her books is fine. This is just my recommendation. So if you want to see a continuation of 84 Charing Cross Road, if you want to see her finally get to London and meet some of the people in 84 Charing Cross Road, then Duchess of Bloomsbury Street is probably the way to go. But if you like Helene as a person, which is personally where I'm coming from, then I think reading either Underfoot in Show Business or Q's Legacy next would probably be best. But in 84 Charing Cross Road, if you fall in love with Helene Hanff as a New Yorker, or if you yourself love New York City, then maybe you want to move on to Apple of My Eye or Letter from New York. But honestly, all 6 of her books are worth reading, so any of the other 5 you want to move on to is perfectly fine. I think all of them are great. They just offer different things. Although I definitely recommend that you start with 84 Charing Cross Road in whatever order you end up reading these 6 books, which I should mention are all very short and very readable. You're going to get the full picture. You're going to get a sense of who she was as a person, and hopefully you will fall in love with her as much as I did. But that was my author spotlight on the absolutely wonderful Helene Hanff. If you're a fan of hers, you want to tell me what you love about her, you want to tell me what your favorite book of hers is, or if you're just getting started with her work, you want to tell me what you just read, what you're about to read, any of that or any more general comments or questions, I would love to read in the comment section below. But if you would like to keep up with what I am reading and writing about right now, you can find me on a variety of places around the internet, including Goodreads and Instagram, where I'm the most active. The links to everywhere you can find me will be at the bottom of the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.